Thank you for joining us today for the Transforming Construction Network Plus Constructive Conversations. Starting with the end-to-end in mind, transforming productivity in construction supply chains. I'm Jan Godsell and I'm a co-investigator for the Transform Construction Network Plus. I'm delighted to chair the session today on productivity in construction supply chains. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's session is being recorded. The recording of the webinar with the slides will be shared by email after the event and will be accessible on our website in a few days. We also invite you to comment and share your questions. If you wish to ask a question to the speakers, please use the Q&A option that appears at the bottom of your screen. Please note that you can choose to ask your questions anonymously or not. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation, and in fact, we'd really encourage it because it helps to get the conversation going, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any comments or if you have any technical issues and need support, please use the chat feature on your screen. Please do not use the chat for asking questions. Finally, we also live tweet the events using the hashtag TCN+. Please feel free to share your thoughts and views on Twitter. Ooh. The Transform Construction Network Plus is a movement that mobilises the construction community, bringing together experts from a range of disciplines to tackle the most pressing problems across digital, energy, construction and the manufacturing space. The network uses academic researchers with industry and policy representatives through networking and skills building events, creating a community and body of knowledge to inform future construction policy and practice. The Network Plus also provided funding for the research projects through 2 funding calls. The Network Plus is one of the investments in the Transforming Construction Challenge, the UK government's challenge to the construction industry and research communities to make buildings more affordable, efficient, safer and healthier. The Network Plus is a joint project between the Bartlett UCL's Faculty of the Built Environment, Imperial College London and WMG University of Warwick. Oh, why does it keep doing that? I'm so sorry. I seem to be having a slight issue with the slides. I think it's my Mac. So to launch this constructive conversation, the sort of seed of the idea behind it was actually a digest that we've written, which actually looks at how we can start with the end in mind and how we can look at transforming productivity across construction supply chains. Now, my background is actually in manufacturing and supply chain management, and I'm a relatively newcomer to construction, having started to work in the field around 6 years ago when I got involved in a Innovate UK project looking at how we could improve supply chain integration in construction. Now, as someone whose expertise is in supply chain and manufacturing, I've done research over the last 20, 30 years across all sectors, whether that be automotive, pharmaceutical, even things like submarines and warships. And I'd never ever looked to pigeonhole particular sectors or the role of supply chain in particular sectors. Part of what our workers look to do is to look to see how good practices could potentially be transformed between different sectors. And when we started working with the construction sector 6, 7 years ago, one of the things that really struck me, and at that time, the projects that I was looking at were more to do with infrastructure. So that's the infrastructure of water utilities, also of highways. What really struck me was the similarities in those infrastructure projects between projects that I'd seen in Ministry of Defence supply chains, particularly around the building and maintenance and repair and overhaul of warships and submarines. And in that respect, it then reminded me similarly of perhaps how we might construct things in the oil and gas industry, such as oil platforms, or even in the chemical industry when I worked for ICI, when we used to construct chemical plants. But what we also saw during that time was that there were some real differences in the way that a construction supply chain was constructed that was different to manufacturing. And actually, in writing this digest, those sorts of similarities yet differences were brought to mind. And literally earlier this morning, as a result of the digest, I was just having a chat with somebody that's involved in construction excellence in the Southwest, who first heard of the terms of supply chain way back in sort of 1992, but is equally slightly perplexed as to why these principles that could potentially be really, really useful in construction have been difficult to adopt. And one of the things that he was suggesting is because we don't take enough effort to contextualize manufacturing concepts in the construction context. And so if we think about a classic manufacturing supply chain, we really just focus on the flow of material. We do think about the flow of cash, but we certainly don't, as this slide currently shows, really have to think about the labour supply chain, nor the equipment supply chain, nor necessarily the professional services supply chain. However, when I was doing some work with Babcock, looking at the how they maintain our warships and submarines, they would certainly consider all four of these elements too. And I suppose one of the things that's also different in a construction supply chain, that there's quite often a construction or civil engineering firm who take on that coordinating role of those four different flows to actually deliver the project to the end customer. And I suppose what we can sometimes see in construction that, again, slightly different to manufacturing, is both the size and scale of these projects tend to be much, much bigger, but therefore then the frequency with which they occur is much, much lower. And Lisa, I think I'm going to ask you to actually go on to my next slide, because every time I seem to click on my computer, I seem to go to do something slightly unusual. So thank you very much. Now, I am a bit of a supply chain I'm very evangelical about supply chains, and I have a view that perhaps comes from the theory, but also perhaps what we've seen in some manufacturing context about what good really looks like. And in my mind, and if you actually think back to some of the things that you may have read about, even going back to sort of Michael Porter's work in the 1980s, the sort of ideal vision of a supply chain is truly end-to-end. So people talk about supply chains from mining materials out the ground to the recycling of products at the end. So whether that be grass to grass, I've heard one food industry supply chain described. It's really thought of as very holistic. And I think end-to-end is perhaps the ultimate goal. But the reality is, when we look both within manufacturing, but more so within construction, the way in which these supply chain is perceived is slightly different. And actually, when we started to look at construction and think about it more carefully, what we're actually seeing is that there's four different roles that a supply chain manager can play in construction. And what can sometimes be confusing is we use the word supply chain manager, but we don't necessarily clarify when we use the word which of the four roles the supply chain manager is actually carrying out. And interestingly, I've seen something similar in the automotive industry, which construction quite often hold up as a sort of exemplar of supply chain management. The first role, and it's actually the most common role that we see within construction, it's actually the most common role that we see within the automotive industry as well, is the role that a supply chain manager is someone who manages the supply base. So essentially their role is one of supplier or supply base management. That can then be extended or, I suppose, also augmented by a different type of role, which is the resource flow management role. And this is slightly different. That it assumes that procurement have perhaps done the role of setting up the contracts, and then the supply chain manager in this context is the person that manages those flows of resource onto the construction site, whether that's material, labour, equipment, or professional services. There are some construction firms that then put those two roles together. And so we would call this integrated resource flow management, where you're doing both the supply-based management and then managing that flow of resource onto site. And then the final view is that more end-to-end perspective, which is looking at multiple echelons across the supply chain. It will be starting with the client, and it will be understanding end client demands. So for instance, if we were to think about something like a water infrastructure project, that would be something like the utility company who's giving the 5-year plan that meets the AMP period, and then they're releasing the demand for those projects over that 5-year AMP to the construction firm, who can then plan and coordinate the projects across that 5-year time horizon, both with the suppliers to set up the framework agreements, but then actually managing the flow of resources onto site to actually manage the individual projects within that programme of work. Next slide. And in essence, if we're aiming towards that end-to-end view, what that actually achieves for construction is slightly different. And perhaps herein lies the rub as to why it's quite difficult to actually move from a fairly functional or functionally optimized view of construction to one that perhaps the Egan report all those many years ago was alluding to what could be achieved, and I suppose to what the holy grail of supply chain is all about, which is enabling flow and hence enabling productivity. And the way in which we can do that is to actually think about a number of different elements. So the first of those is actually the organisational structure. And this is actually setting up the organisational structure in a way that's going to enable a seamless process. And this means that we need to look beyond organising around functions to actually building a organisational structure that actually creates flow along the length of the organisation. So we did a study in manufacturing, and we back in 2016, and actually of the 100 plus manufacturers in Europe that we interviewed or surveyed, only 17% of them had an organisational structure that was actually supporting the view of supply chain management as a business process. The vast majority of them just had a sort of functional and regional approach to their organisational structure. However, Beiersdorf stood out. They're a large consumer packaged good organisation. You may know them for brands like Nivea face cream, but actually what they had is that classic functional regional structure. But in addition, they then had 4 core business processes which created flow across their business: brand management, supply chain management, customer relationship management, and new product introduction. And so actually putting this idea that you could create an overarching business process that sucks resources out of your functions to enable the delivery of a programme of work, I think could be very useful to construction. The second is integrated planning. So one of the things that we've observed that within construction industry, you are absolutely superb at programme, portfolio and project management. But actually planning of the flow of material and integrated planning end to end is perhaps not something that is so commonplace. So for instance, although we can create 5-year AMP periods, which would essentially, you would think, mean that all projects were planned over a 5-year planning horizon, I think in some of the better cases of the utility companies that run those arrangements, they do. But quite often burdens such as, oh, we don't know what our financial priorities are, and the budget keeps changing, means that projects that could be released over a much longer planning horizon get released maybe every 3 months. And actually, if you can take a more integrated approach to planning, particularly something like a 5-year time horizon, you can then essentially plan your project in a way that not only enables the construction firm or the contractor to plan their resources in an efficient way, they can then pass that stable demand pattern onto their suppliers, and it really helps bring framework agreements to life. But in order to do that, you need better visibility, because what you need to be able to see is what's that demand pattern for your projects looking like, or even elements within a project, what they're looking like over that period of time. Because fundamentally, what we're looking to do is to identify where there is parts of a project, whether that be at the top level, project level, but even materials or activities within a project that can be repeated, because that can then create a baseline level of stable demand that can act as the glue that holds the supply chain together. And in order for that to work, what you need to be able to do is to identify the right size of buffers. Now, in a manufacturing context, we hold buffers as inventory or spare manufacturing capacity. In construction, you may need to hold that capacity within the supply chain as perhaps buffers of goods, whether that be some of the materials that you need to bring onto site, but it could also be buffers of those other flows that you're managing, such as professional services or labour, because if you've got a variable demand signal and you want to be able to respond, the only way to do that is to actually have some I suppose, resource available that can be deployed in response to that need. However, if you can plan things in advance, it makes it much, much easier to be able to get the right resource in the right place, but minimising the buffers and hence reducing the cost. Next slide, please, Lisa. And so actually what we'd be encouraging you all to do is to essentially find the economies of repetition. Now, in a manufacturing context, we work with organisations large and small to essentially help them find what we call is the base level demand. And when we started our work in construction 7 years ago, we were wondering whether that same concept could apply in construction, which seemed to be such a very different environment. But the work that we did, looking at the water sector and highways, actually identified that if you can bring these longer planning horizons to fruition, there are actually elements of projects that are highly repeatable. In fact, the water portfolio of projects that we looked at, we found out that nearly 60% of projects were potentially repeatable and could be planned in a different way. And so what we were able to do is to identify a slightly different category of projects. And it's what we call a programme of repetitive projects. And so essentially here, what you're trying to do is develop a capability to be able to firstly identify either at a project level or at a level within a project, so be this at an activity level, something that is repeatable. And then by identifying that it's repeatable, you can then plan that as a programme of repetitive projects, which not only benefits the construction firm trying to plan their on-site activities, it then enables them to pass on that same stable demand signal to their suppliers, and then their suppliers to their suppliers. So it brings stability and productivity to the entire end-to-end construction supply chain. So that's our vision. That's how we've taken some principles from manufacturing, particularly fast-moving consumer goods, but I've actually tried to work quite hard through the Transform Construction Network Plus to turn that into something that is better contextualised for construction and hopefully can act as a seed for a constructive conversation. So going forward to the next slide, please. If you haven't already done so, we would very much like you to download the digest, and it will help you look at how you could build better end-to-end integration, perhaps a bit more background on the economies of repetition. And also it begins to touch upon how we can use some digital technologies, particularly around some of the advanced analytics and machine learning supply chain software to help with those supply chain planning activities. But it's my great pleasure now to start to build on the conversation and to introduce Shaun. Shaun is a Director of Action Sustainability and is Chair of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, as well as the Chair of the IEMA Professional Standards Committee. He's the Chair for Action Sustainability at Asia Pacific, and he's a trustee of the Green Shoots Foundation Trust. From 2006 to 2013, he was chair of the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012, a groundbreaking assurance body for directly advising the Mayor of London and the Olympics Minister. Shaun was awarded an OBE for services to sustainability and London 2012 in Her Majesty the Queen's 2013 birthday honours list. He is a Fellow of the Institute Environmental Management and Assessment, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and a member of the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. It's my great pleasure to hand over to Shaun.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan, and good afternoon, everybody. I wonder, we've got 70 people in the audience today. I wonder how many of you recognise the name John Wayne Bobbitt. For those that do, you'll know what I'm talking about. For those that don't, do Google it, but I don't recommend Google Images. All I would say on to this audience is the American police in July 1994 were called out to what could only be described as a very bizarre domestic violence incident. In that same month, July 1994, Sir Michael Latham produced his first report into the construction industry. At the time, I was working in procurement in the oil and gas sector, but being a curious procurement person, I went along to the launch event. I must admit, I was a little bit shocked. It seemed that, you know, the central idea was, why don't we ditch all of these very adversarial contracting methodologies that we have in the sector, where we push risk down to the lowest common denominator, we buy on price, and we end up then dealing with multiple claims and counterclaims, which interferes with the productivity of the sector. Wouldn't it be a good idea if we had more collaborative procurement techniques and better ways of working? I must admit, I thought that was a bit strange, because coming from the oil and gas sector, we've been doing that since the 80s. And it seemed a bit bizarre to me that the construction sector wasn't. I was, however, very impressed at that event with a presentation by John Egan at the time. And I was so impressed, I went and joined his organization. And in 1995, I joined BAA at Heathrow. And I was involved in completely transforming the project process at BAA, and also more collaborative procurement methodologies like the Terminal 5 agreement. After a very long public inquiry, Terminal 5 was eventually built on time and on budget, and the way in which we contracted for Terminal 5 was hailed as a success. Unfortunately, what happened then, of course, in 2008, the global financial crisis hit everybody, and we all reverted to type. We went back to fixed price competitive tender. We actually regressed at that time. Since then, other projects have and clients have been more enlightened. As Jan mentioned, I was deeply involved in the London 2012 Olympics, also delivered under budget and on time with some quite progressive contracting methodologies. One of the things that came out of the Olympics program was the level of competence in the supply chain, and it originally manifested itself as sustainability competence. Given we were driving very, very high standards of sustainability in the Olympics program, it really exposed the lack of capability down into the multi-tiered supply chain, which is really what prompted us to start the supply chain school in 2012. We started the school with 7 partners, all of whom had a common objective to upskill their supply chains in sustainability, because they recognized that they couldn't do it on their own. You know, there is no one organization that has the capacity to upskill an entire sector. If you're going to do that, you need to do it collaboratively. So we started the school with 7 partners. We now have 109 partners in the supply chain school. We're delivering learning to some 48,000 people from around about 14,000 organizations. And the school has gone from strength to strength in that we're not only delivering learning, we're also driving leadership agendas around a number of areas. So climate change, waste, modern slavery, labor standards, a whole range of things where we're really trying to use the procurement power of our partners to deliver on improved standards. We've also expanded the school out now, so we have a school for lean construction, a school for off-site construction. We're doing some work at the moment on digitization in the construction sector. We're also doing some work on procurement, where we can roll out some learning on more collaborative forms of procurement, or indeed just better procurement, because the procurement competence in the construction sector is really not great. So I think for me that the central message in all of this, and it's very interesting if we go back through, you know, Latham, Egan, and all of these reports into the sector, it's been very simple shorthand to say, well, why can't construction be like manufacturing? The productivity of the construction sector hasn't moved at all since the mid-90s, whereas the productivity in sectors like manufacturing, and in particular automotive, has moved on massively. Well, the sectors aren't the same, and people in construction get quite annoyed when you say, well, can't you build buildings like cars? Because they will always say, well, car manufacturers, you know, build millions of the same cars all the time. It's not like that for us. Every project is different. That's kind of true, but also we need to ask ourselves why every project is different. And this is back to Jan's point about repeatability. They shouldn't all be different, but yes, the sector is different and the supply chain of the sector is different. The construction sector ultimately is what I often describe as a Tower of Babel of small businesses. Underneath the big names, the Skanskas, the Balfour Beatties, etc., there are thousands or tens of thousands of small businesses all contributing to a construction program. So the challenge for me, and the challenge that we're trying to address in the supply chain school, is how do we deliver that upskilling at scale and in a consistent way? If we can get 100+ partners together, all to provide consistent messages down their supply chain and create a hub for learning and development for that supply chain, and make it the go-to place for practical learning, then we can start to move things, and we can start to move the agenda. But it's a big challenge. It's a really difficult thing to change the sector, and you know, credit to all of those organizations, past, present, and future, that have moved the dial a little bit. So out of Latham, we had organizations like Constructing Excellence. We had organizations like Considerate Constructors that still exist now. As a result of the Egan report, we moved things on again, little by little, but not enough. And that transformative change in the construction industry hasn't happened yet. And for me, this is the heart of this is in the way that we procure, the forms of contract that we use, and the way that we manage our relationships. Also, if we're going to change that, then actually how do we upskill, and how do we communicate, and how do we take all of those hundreds of thousands of small businesses with us? And that, for me, my little bit of it in the sector is all about helping to be able to deliver that learning at scale, and to create a route to market for the new thinking that's coming out of the sector now. And the Construction Leadership Council is doing a lot to look at the way we actually transform supply chain relationships and procurement. I don't profess to be one of those clever people that's inventing those new ways of doing things, and you'll hear from some of them from subsequent presentations. But what we can offer is that route to that learning and influence across the sector, which is absolutely critical if we're going to take the sector forward. So I'll stop there. Just to give you a brief overview. Very happy, obviously, to take more questions when we get into the Q&A. Thank you.
That's probably the most common phrase of 2020, which is, Jan, you're on mute, or you're on mute more generally. So thank you very, very much, Shaun. They were some really great insights, and I look forward to discussing them more in the conversation at the end. So I'm now going to introduce our second conversant. who is Nigel Blundell. Are we going to move to the next slide? There we go. So Nigel is a partner at Pinsent Masons, and Nigel specialises in the negotiation and drafting of construction contracts. So it's a really nice build on what Shaun was just mentioning about one of the areas where we have a particular challenge. He has a wide-ranging practice covering both infrastructure and development projects. Nigel advises contractors in relation to both rail and light rail projects, where he has negotiated and developed collaborative and alliancing contracts. He is the co-author of both of Pinsent Masons' reports on collaboration in the construction industry, and he advises both employers and contractors across a number of sectors, including university accommodation, office developments, and regeneration. So at this point, I'd like to hand the conversation over to Nigel.
Jan, thank you. To build on what both you and Shaun said, I think the first thing to say is that I'm going to look at some of the things that we're seeing in the market, but I think a point that Shaun was making is that to all intents and purposes, the form of contract should be driven by the market's behaviour and appetite for the way that they work, rather than lawyers trying to devise forms of contract. What I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes or so is to look at some of the themes that came out of the Transforming Construction Network paper, Supply Chain Productivity in Construction, and apply some of the things that we're seeing in the market to the four models that disclosed, being single project management, which are often unique or large projects and can be strategic in nature, multiple project management, which are categorized as low intermittent projects managed as a group of unrelated or quite routine projects, traditional program management such as AMP5, CP5 and CP6 in rail, which is a set of projects linked to a strategic goal, discrete projects which can vary in size, and then program management of repetitive projects. To pick up on Shaun's theme through Latham and Egan, it's often said that either we're in or on the cusp of the next industrial revolution. And I think that that is probably the case in construction. And there are two areas which I think will drive that. The first of which is modular, and the second of which is digitalization. And to deal with modular, it needs a step change, not only in the way that contracts are made, but I think across the piece, that you probably have a situation where designers need to design for manufacture so that there is great efficiency in what they produce. Because of the way that modular works, it's not possible to turn on and off the tap, so that there needs to be some sort of security of workflow for the efficiencies which work through factory. When you actually go and have a look at these factories, they are significant in scale. You can understand that actually having to try and change the speed at which they work is going to be a bit like turning around an oil tanker. So what you're probably going to have to look at if you look into the future is relationships between clients and modular providers, which deal with a certainty of workflow with incentives for meeting that, and potentially also making sure that if those metrics aren't actually met, there's still some sort of payment made in terms of the shortfall in volume. The other issue is with digitalization, that usually we've worked on contracts that are bilateral with joint and several liability. And once you get into BIM and federated models where everybody's contributing, that tends to blur the lines of responsibility, that it becomes a lot more difficult to actually work out what may or may not have gone wrong. And therefore, you need to look at perhaps contracts which are across a range of disciplines with a range of participants. And equally, with data becoming a bigger issue, understanding and dealing with how data ownership will be dealt with in contracts is a challenge that I think construction is just at the start of. So how do we look at that? I think there are two main areas. There's enterprise models, which I'll talk about first. There's then, I suppose, the way that contracting can reflect those enterprise models. And then we'll finish with a look at frameworks. Enterprise models are, I think, quite exciting in big infrastructure projects. They are something that we all need to be aware of because they've got significant buy-in. The key one is ICE's Project 13, and that's supported by the Infrastructure Client Group. So in terms of big infrastructure projects in the United Kingdom in the future, then this sort of model will probably be at the forefront of contracting strategies. They could be categorized, I think, almost as companies for projects, that they have a goal of actually delivering the project in the most efficient way. As a company, you become integrated and aligned and commercially incentivized, and essentially you have pretty mature and sophisticated relationships between owners, investigators, integrators, advisors, and suppliers. The difference, I think, is this, that and this cuts through, I think, everything I'm going to say from now on, that its construction, I think, is counterintuitive. That if you are spending a whole bunch of money in the tens or hundreds or even billions of pounds, you want to control it. You want to pass risk through to the supply chain, and you want to manage it really tightly. But when you actually look at the statistics coming in construction and work out why projects are delayed or they have cost overruns, it tends to come from the client actually making decisions at the wrong time or not setting things up correctly. So essentially what the integrated model it does in terms of enterprise is that the client sits very much at the center of the project and defines long-term value and has relationships with all the key suppliers, professionals, advisors, and those who are installing. And to facilitate that, there's a party known as the integrator who will actively integrate and engage with all tiers of the market. And the other way that the contract differs is that you don't reward the contractor just simply for building the asset and the price of building it. You look at the project on a longer term basis. You look at asset management and operation rather than simply asset creation. You're looking into the long-term performance of the asset, what's best in terms of whole life cost and efficiency rather than initial costs. And when you look at the things that Shaun talks about in terms of sustainability and where we are in terms of zero carbon, that kind of thing is going to become really important. It's not just a question of knocking the job out as cheaply as possible. It's going to be a question of actually looking at the long-term sustainability of the project and in terms of the management of it in the future once it's been handed over following completion. And I think what that can be categorized as is that this is about outcomes for ultimate customers rather than simply an output for the client. And once you get into that, where everybody's buying into a series of metrics, and that probably means you're not on a fixed price basis, you're looking to incentivize the supply chain to actually work in a way that delivers what you want, then you have something which is quite powerful, and you move away from that fixed price model where risk is essentially allocated rather than managed. So how do we do that contractually? Essentially, what I've been involved in around a number of the contracts in the rail industry is alliancing projects where the client sits not only as client, but also as part of the delivery team. And coming back to that point about devolving the management of the project to a delivery team, if you've got a team that is incentivized and working on what's known as a best for project basis, so they're looking after the project's interests rather than their own, then that's quite powerful. You can only move forward if all of the parties agree at board level that you've got essentially unanimous decision making, and you have to align interests. There can't be situations where there are win-lose solutions. So if the project beats budget and it beats all the other KPI metrics, then everybody shares in the success of it. And if the converse is true, then everybody shares in the pain of it. In terms of some of the longer programs of work that Jan mentioned, the multiple project management, traditional project management and program management of repetitive projects, then what we can see as a way of deriving value is to set up long-term frameworks that, to all intents and purposes, if you take those team building principles that I've described on a project level and put them into a framework, then again you can drive value over the longer term, and you can begin to work in a way which is consistent and collaborative, and you can incentivize the supply chain. One of the most well-known standard frameworks is Dr. David Mosey of King's College's FAC1, which underpins the £30 billion Crown Commercial Services Construction Framework. And that works on an alliancing basis with a core group to stimulate the strategic direction of it. Underpinning that are key metrics such as the objectives for the framework, improving value, success measures and targets. And one of those is very much about looking into and after the supply chain, that the core group can ask the framework members to work with the supply chain to share information on their contracts, look at the value offered by the supply chain across a framework, and work together to try to get to longer term, larger scale supply chain contracts with improved working practices, which presumably or hopefully will derive value and generate more efficiency. I do think there's a caveat around that if you get to a certain size of project, that some of that behaviour has to be very careful, otherwise it might become anti-competitive. But it just shows that a framework properly set up can be a very powerful tool. But just to finish with a couple of case examples, we advised a holiday village operator a number of years ago. Interestingly, bearing in mind what Jan's background is and what she said about motor manufacturing, their development team were people who'd come out of various of the major manufacturers. And when they looked at what they were trying to do, they worked to a point where they got to a standard design, which they engaged an architect to produce. And then they had bought the design off the architect, so they owned it with paying a license fee for future use. Initially, they were using main contractors, but they brought the construction function in-house. And having done that, they then essentially secured the supply chain, that they talked to a couple of suppliers in each of the key disciplines, sought terms from them, and therefore had the situation they didn't have all of their eggs in one basket, but were getting to a point where they knew they had good quality, reputable contractors who could deliver for them time after time. The other, and in closing, I wanted to talk about the Surrey Highways framework, which was where Dr. Mosey road tested his contract for the first time. This was a long-term maintenance contract for the highways. And basically, the framework consisted of the main contractor here and two key suppliers being Aggregates Industries and Marshalls. And the incentive for the contractors was if they could deliver the work efficiently by demonstrating that they were reducing cost, that there was the potential for an additional framework to be offered to them at the expiry of the first one. And by working closely with these tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, they got some significant discounts that were quantified at the fact that they'd got Aggregates Industries and Marshall involved in the planning work and developing continuity of work meant that 2% came off the price. Because there was an agreed minimum annual volume of work, 5% was a reduction that could be applied. Because there was efficiency around the size of minimum orders, that took another 2% off. Prompt payment took another percentage off. And I think the one that I always think shows that working collaboratively does pay dividends is that because the contractor didn't need to take a lease of a compound, but was able to use facilities that Surrey owned, they managed to get another 2% off. And what did that mean in terms of the finished product? Well, it meant because of the continuity of work and the fact they were working closely that the contractors were able to secure longer warranties for material and pavement design of up to 10 years. You also had assessments of what the risk was in doing the repair work from the specialists. It comes back to Shaun's point about the supply chain having a lot of knowledge, that if you're actually working out the best way to do some repairs, then rather than it being the main contractor who, although very skilled, might be a generalist in the area, if you're going to Aggregates Industries or Marshalls, then you're going to get a much better technical solution. So there was a huge amount of improved quality control through joint risk assessment. In terms of the longer term nature of it, bearing in mind that Surrey would want to stimulate local employment opportunities, it was a good way of securing apprentice commitments. And there was also the ability to work closely around reducing wastage through increasing recycling and reducing landfill. And the net effect was that I think you would see that that meant that the Alliance succeeded in its aims, and Surrey went and let a subsequent contract to the same team for another 55 million pounds. So I think that's quite a powerful example of how thinking about how you structure your projects, even if it's something which is quite routine, can lead to some significant savings. Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you very, very much, Nigel. And if we just move on to the next slide, please. It's my great pleasure to invite us to hear from our third conversant, Elaine Mitchel-Hill, who is a business and human rights lead at Marshalls Group, which is the UK's leading hard landscape company serving both the commercial and domestic construction markets, and with business operations in the UK, but right across the globe. And Elaine develops human rights strategy, including the organisation's response to the UK's Modern Slavery Act in UK business operations. And as a result of this, she has to engage with governments, UN agencies to develop strategy. But she also spends a lot of her time actually hands-on in the supply chains, dealing with a really complex range of issues and stakeholders who have to be engaged to make the meaningful and lasting changes that are required if we want to improve those conditions for vulnerable individuals, workers, their families, and the wider community. So I really look forward to hearing from Elaine on this really, really critical part of the conversation. Thank you very much, Elaine.
Thanks very much, Jan. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to share with you some thoughts to throw them in and hopefully to inspire some conversation around various issues which are very kind of at the fore at the moment. So firstly, in terms of thinking about business and human rights in the construction supply chain, in the wake of the pandemic, we've had a lot of conversation regarding building back better. And, you know, I would like us to think in terms of the conversation about where will the value lie in terms of building back better. Certainly during the pandemic, I've been very aware that the human rights of I guess those directly employed in you know, seem to have outweighed the rights of those who were overseas in supply chains. I think in all sectors, but also in construction sector, in terms of not only temporary labour, but certainly in terms of construction products and materials. Those are conversations that are ongoing, and they're conversations that I'm having at length with peers across sectors. I think there's a lack of conversation around business and human rights in relation to Build Back Better in the construction sector. And I think that's both a threat and an opportunity. And I'm hoping that here we can perhaps start to have a deeper conversation around that. The sustainable approach and sustainable production, again, specifically for us in terms of products and materials, we're looking constantly at issues of the livelihoods of those people that are involved in the supply chain, Of course, we've got our manufacturing operations in the UK, but then we have overseas supply chains, and significant overseas supply chains in terms of natural stone, where the salient risks for us lie. So for us, we are continually looking at what are reasonable deadlines, at planning, at fair payment schedules, and also at fully costed pricing. We are able to pay our suppliers a living wage, and ensure that they then in turn get the benefits and social protection that they might need. But as always, you know, within all organizations, there is always a kind of, I would say, a healthy and dynamic rub in terms of conversations with procurement, with commercial, and certainly with the sustainability team and with the business and human rights team, regarding finding, it's almost like, I would say it's like having a board on top of a football and trying to stand on it. It's constantly moving, as we're talking about the public commitments that we've made, but also the commercial realities of that. I think there's a lot of conversation also around SDG contribution. I think there's, whilst that might have been quite superficial, well, relatively superficial conversation prior to the pandemic, I think there's increased conversation around this, the Sustainable Development Goal contribution, both in terms of not allowing businesses to say that they are making a contribution, but actually providing evidence. I've seen more recently in some responsible investor forums, some organizations kind of pulled out on those points, and I can see pressure increasing there, especially around SDG 8 in terms of decent work and economic growth. For me, I think construction at the moment is lacking a kind of conversation regarding high-risk supply chains, overseas supply chains in terms of products and material. I think the conversation has been very much kind of probably correctly focused on temporary on-site labour and issues of modern slavery in that regard. But I think what we are likely to see moving forward is much more focus. So coming from various places, actually, probably from investor, possibly from government, and also from legal regarding the whole area of supply chain in relation to human rights, specifically in relation to construction products and materials. I think there probably has not been enough conversation around any levelling of the playing field with regards to those suppliers who do endeavour to be ethical and ensure that there aren't any violations in supply chains, and those that don't. And also the role of specifiers in the procurement process. So there may well be internal policies in place, but I think perhaps an increased conversation about across that supply chain, who are those individuals who are specifying products, and as Nigel alluded to, where there is perhaps an increased focus on carbon, will likely be an increased focus on water, on energy, on social value. Who is involved in making those, in specifying those products and materials who are coming, that are coming into play? And also, what does that mean when that, how does that translate to site level? So as projects get squeezed, our products substituted at site, and what then therefore is the impact on the supply chain, right back to raw materials and back to source. I think we started to see some pressure kind of being applied in terms of the Operation Fort report, and some operators, certainly in a UK context, being identified as needing to pay greater attention there. In terms of the impact of the pandemic, I kind of share with you from my perspective from in relation to the natural stone sector in India. We've worked really hard over probably 15 years now regarding the impact of the sandstone sector on child labour, and we've made some gains along the way. We've learned what works, we've learned what doesn't work. We've you know, I'm very clear that increasingly moving forward, this is going to be have to be much more of a collaborative space, not only between brands and businesses in country, but also governments. I think worryingly, most recently the ILO had indicated that any gains that had been made in the last decade quite possibly could have been lost with regards to children and child labour as a result of the pandemic, and that has very kind of big implications for certainly for natural stone supply chains. I think what it's also pushed us to do as an organisation, the pandemic, is to look at how we increase our use of technology in terms of going beyond audit to understand what's happening in those supply chains, especially when we haven't been able to get feet on the ground and where we have relied extensively upon our existing networks and relationships. But we are absolutely beginning now to use big data and also live monitoring, in addition to the things that we already had in place, such as grievance mechanisms and undercover human rights observations. So I think that that the pandemic has definitely changed that landscape for us and for the sector as a whole. A quick nod to what are the legal responsibilities in terms of human rights and specifically modern slavery. Obviously, we've got the Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, so transparency in supply chains. We've got those both in scope and also those who supply to organisations that are in scope. So I think we'll see increased pressure there. The introduction of the Modern Slavery Repository by the government later on next year, and also the associated questions that are asked when organisations deposit their modern slavery statement, I think will start to breathe some additional transparency and accountability into that process. It will make it much easier for anyone who wants to go and look at perhaps more of a like for like in terms of who's reporting what. I think the single reporting deadline is likely to make it easier for stakeholders who want to understand who's doing what. And also perhaps an increased use of the modern slavery assessment tool, the Home Office's modern slavery assessment tool, which I guess has the potential to be used to monitor contracts over the duration that they take. I think that will be an interesting space to watch. I would also just give a nod to the legislative kind of trajectory. So for me, kind of looking back to 2008 and the work of John Ruggie and the national action plans that fell out of that and the UN guiding principles, what we've seen certainly over more recent years is an increasing number of pieces of legislation coming out. So one of which obviously was the UK Modern Slavery Act. Most recently, we've seen Switzerland introduce a new precedent for responsible business, and we've got incoming EU mandatory human rights due diligence laws on the horizon, which will still impact us in some way, shape or form. I think the trends are showing that the regulatory environment will continue to evolve and expand, and they will really start to drive issues beyond price, as I think both Shaun and Nigel have already alluded to. One final area that I hope that we're going to see more activity in is in relation to investors scrutinising construction sector more. So in terms of obviously ESG reporting and ratings agencies, but also perhaps more specifically focused upon modern slavery and human rights. And I would point to CCLA's Find It, Fix It, Prevent It initiative for those of you who wanted to know more. So I think there's a number of things that I've thrown in there that I'm hoping will stimulate conversation, and I am more than happy to pick up any questions. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Elaine. And if we just move to our next slide, then it's with my great pleasure that I now move to the Q&A session and let the conversation really begin. And thank you very much to everyone that's already posted a question, and please do continue to add your questions so that we can build them into the conversation. So where to begin? So actually someone made a great point, which is this, the topic of this conversation is about starting with the end-to-end in mind. And we were therefore asked, does that mean you start with the clients? And so actually, I think there's quite an interesting set of questions that have been emerging around the role of the clients. So first, if Shaun doesn't mind, there was a quite direct question that was perhaps asked towards him about the role of the clients, that maybe was asking about what is it about clients such as Heathrow that enabled them to get it right? And I suppose extrapolating from that, do you have any basis of advice for other companies to be a good client?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and the concept of the intelligent client is one that tends to be thrown around the industry, and that varies across the industry. We do have some intelligent clients, but we have some clients who are maybe striving for more intelligence, shall we say. I guess if I look at my experience both at BAA and on the Olympics, it was really about getting the best people into client organizations, and there was an awful lot of controversy about the ODA in London 2012 and some of the salaries that were being paid to the top executives, not including me, I would have hastened to add, because I was the independent commission. But then, this was an Olympic Games. Had it been a bit shoddy and not delivered on time, then I think the public would have said, well, why didn't you get the best people to deliver this? So I think there's something about getting talented people and allowing them and empowering them to use those talents to do their jobs well, and in some cases paying what it takes to get those people that can deliver for you. We tend to, if we look into government organizations, the culture in the civil service tends to be very much of generalists rather than specialists, and in industry, you tend to have experts who were empowered to deliver that expertise. So part of it is all about people, I think, and having the right people in the right places at the right time. There's something about the culture of an organization as well that's that's up for change and is willing to change, and also to back themselves. If it was interesting, Nigel mentioning David Mosey, and we're working with David in the supply chain school at delivering some of the more what I would describe as high-end procurement learning that we're doing. And I also worked with a very well-known lawyer at BAA, Fiona Hammond, who basically was the architect of the T5 agreement. That was a massively risky step. And it was born out of the tunnel collapse in Heathrow Express, where the lawyer spent 10 years arguing about whose fault it was that the tunnel fell down. And Fiona was in the middle of that and was very determined for that not to happen on Terminal 5. So I think there's a mixture of things in there. It's about right people, right place, empowering people to use their expertise. It's about having a client that's prepared to back themselves in terms of maybe doing something different. And in some cases, that can be driven either by adversity, a past adversity, in the case of BA and the Heathrow Tunnel collapse Heathrow Express Tunnel collapse in the 1990s, or driven by, in the case of the Olympics, an immovable deadline. Not, if the Olympic Park had been like Crossrail, we would never have had an Olympics in London. There was delaying the projects was not an option. So in some cases, it's that burning platform, and sometimes we don't have that in the construction sector.
If I could perhaps come in, I agree that great people. I think time, in a slightly different context, Shaun, that I think that innovation and looking at different ways of doing things, you need scale, and it's important to have these big projects, because once it's proven to work in those circumstances, then you can take the best bits as people move on, or they look at it, and it can then trickle down and become potentially the norm. And the other one is, I think, funding. That I've looked at some of the questions that have come in, and it's always interesting to look at who is prepared to do what. That I think with collaboration and working on anything other than a fixed price contract, to be fairly blunt about it, equity tends to get it and debt doesn't. So if you have the ability to fund a project either through the public sector or through your own assets, I think it becomes an awful lot easier to be innovative, because it becomes risk reward, whereas banks have slightly different disciplines around the reasons that they will lend and what their rate of return and their exit is. And collaboration, I think it's only just now that they're beginning to see the benefit of perhaps moving away from the sorts of models they have for development funding. The other point I think about funding is this, that you need to have essentially the funding on tap. I was going to use the word security, but that obviously has a different meaning in the context of lending. That if you look at Network Rail, they started off and with the trailblazers around collaborative construction around 2012 with sort of the alliance which came in with David Higgins from Australia. But the reason that they've gone bearish on it is that there's a gateway system within DFT that you can only get a tranche of funding to go to the next level. And before the next stage is put in place, you need to keep the contract and design team going. And that tends to be on an emerging cost basis before you've actually struck the incentives and the target package. And therefore, the overall value, if you're not able to go through it at the right speed, diminishes the benefits of the overall project.
That's great. We're talking about the client too. There's an aspect I want to come back to ask you about more specifically in a moment, Nigel, but I just wanted to bring Elaine into the debate because obviously you're a supplier to many of the construction firms, and there was a question that was posed to yourself, which is, and again, I suppose this links into the role of a good client, but really it was linking into to what extent do your clients support and enable you to be able to deliver in a socially responsible way?
I think I like to believe that we're coming towards a tipping point where I think a lot of the work that we've done previously would be actually around kind of working to share and educate our clients in terms of the issues that we're encountering, and then the measures we're putting in place to address some of those inequalities down the supply chain. But at the end of the day, that often reflects in the price of the product.
Yeah.
I think moving forward, certainly in terms of local authorities coming in scope of the Modern Slavery Act, one would hope that local authorities will not just be looking at cost of product, in terms of that. If you like thinking about natural stone, that commodity, I think perhaps we're moving more towards a decommoditization of commodity, where a whole series of other questions are answered and certainly are asked, and one of those is certainly around social value. So I think we're still on that journey, and obviously price is still up there and kind of leading the debate.
And we'll come back to the question about sort of price or cost versus value. But there was also another sort of just question that was much more specific, which was really essentially asking whether or not countries without a democratic system or independent system of justice can actually deliver sustainable products.
Yeah, okay, so it's a challenge. So where we've got the non-implementation of the rule of law in sourcing countries, so okay, let me come at this from a different angle. So in terms of responding to the Modern Slavery Act and chasing back through supply chains to raw materials, we can in effect put in really strong measures to within our direct suppliers to police and manage that supply chain. I think what I found where we've got salient issues is we start to hit a real brick wall in terms of the non-implementation of the rule of law, and then we definitely need to work with certainly with our own government, with governments, and it's quite interesting to see in relation to overseas aid now that they're looking to align that to work with the private sector to address issues of modern slavery and human trafficking, for example. So so there are things that can be done. So our strategy in India would be different, for example, than that in Vietnam, because the issues are different. I would say it still continues to be challenging, but that doesn't mean to say that we have to let up. And we come at it from a whole different array of angles to push back, I guess, ultimately on the implementation of those laws.
No, that's great. So still with this sort of starting with the end in mind, there's questions then also about, you know, how are we going to bring about this true transformation in construction? And one of these true transformations seems to be how we actually move from a outcome-based, how we move from an output-based approach to an outcome-based approach. Now, you started to touch on this, Nigel, so perhaps you could comment first, and then I'll go to Shaun and then to Elaine. But Nigel, what do you think? One top tip for moving from that could really help shift the dial from output to outcome?
Again, I think it comes down to who you're working for and with, that it's not something that will work on every single project, that it's, I think, an understanding of what the overall aims of the project are. It might be easier in infrastructure. With the built environment, I think there's still probably going to be a resistance to this, simply because there will be the need for developers to maximize profit, that it's probably just a question of the bigger players understanding the benefits as much as anything else. There are, I think, a whole host of issues around how to work more collaboratively and work on an output-based specification. And I think the key one really is in terms of that integration, and perhaps trying to get to a position where the ability to have recourse for default is more limited.
Absolutely. Shaun?
Yeah, I would agree with Nigel. It's possibly slightly easier to take this approach in a more infrastructure-led environment. The difficulty with the built environment sector is that the structure is such that the organisation that develops the site and builds the building isn't necessarily that one that owns or occupies the building in the longer term. So the way in which the industry is structured is a significant barrier. But for public procurement, and any organizations that are owning and operating assets for the long term, then it's a kind of, why wouldn't you start with an outcome-based approach, and as you say, start with the end in mind? It makes sense, and it makes no sense to do it any other way. So I think this does again come down to my comment earlier about the intelligent client, having the foresight to think through actually specifying what outcome do you want, and then working from there. Again, the industry is not always necessarily responsive to that. And what tends to happen is, if you do try and do anything different or anything new, then the industry tends to pile a load of risk money into the tender, because you're asking them to do something they don't understand. But then if we do look at organisations that are more enlightened, and the water sector, Anglian Water in particular, United Utilities, Highways England, have that sort of longevity to be able to put signals out to their supply chain to say, this is how we're going to work in the future. So I think you asked earlier for a top tip. I think my top tip would be, get that signal out to your supply chain well ahead of time, so they will compete around the requirement. Supply chains don't like surprises. If you introduce something new quickly, they'll panic and wonder what the risk is of this new thing, and ultimately that leads to the price going up. Because if a supply chain sees risk, they would try and price in that risk. So it's a question of kind of orientating the supply chain towards a new approach, and that can be anything. Can be sustainability, the sort of human rights issue that Elaine mentioned, or indeed the more outcome focused procurement that we all aspire to.
My strong view on clients doing this is that they ought to do it holistically and strategically, that they've got to commit to this long term, and then having done that, they need to work out whether they've got the right people in the right places to do the right jobs, that you've got to have that mindset of collaborating. And it's not, I think, something that clients should go into because it's perceived as fashionable, because I think that if you go into it because it's what everybody else is doing and you don't fully understand or commit to the benefits of it, then you probably do more harm than good.
Okay. Elaine, have you had any, within your organisation, have you seen any difference between outcome or output-based approaches?
Not that I could speak to, but I think from my perspective, what I would like to see is for those to whom we would supply, or others like us would supply, is to ask questions and ask for evidence, in terms of a response to those questions. And I guess my ask of people listening in today would be to engage in those conversations regarding human rights issues and construction that will be forthcoming in 2021.
No, absolutely. And we are getting into our last 10 minutes. So at this point, and then there's been lots of questions, I'm going to try and tie some together, which is really built on a point that Nigel mentioned about us being on a cusp. And someone suggesting, is that cusp not a little bit late coming, given that we're 25 years post-Egan's, which is amusing. But perhaps there's also a thought that this cusp is very much linked to digital technologies, and there's a few questions about digital technologies and references to digitally built Britain. But perhaps my view is that actually we're on the cusp of something much bigger. Elaine mentioned Build Back Better earlier, but that perhaps it is this idea that we need to decouple consumption and production, both in, I suppose, more traditional manufacturing, but also potentially in construction, because actually we're entering a new phase of economic development where perhaps consumption-driven economic growth, that those benefits economically are being outweighed by some of the social and sustainable impacts. So I might start here with Shaun, with your role with the Sustainability School, to think about what's the one piece of practice that if we're going to transform construction, and perhaps think with a slightly different end in mind, but perhaps an end in mind where we are combining not just towards net zero and sustainable considerations, but also those that are responsible. What would your one piece of advice be? And then I'll ask Elaine and then Nigel.
Yeah, I think the future is digital, and to an extent the pandemic has driven us towards that, because lots more people working from home, lots more people where it's possible to do things using robotics, using drones, using camera techniques, etc., where you don't actually have to go to the site. And generally, the fewer people that are on a site, the safer and more productive it is. So I think that there is potentially a tipping point towards digital, but I completely agree with the questioner. If Latham was in 1994, and the construction industry, frankly, has moved very little since. It's been a very long cusp, hasn't it?
Elaine?
From my perspective, I think one of the more exciting things that I'm engaged with at the moment is around the big data project to look at supply chains in the context of human rights, so human trafficking and modern slavery, and so specifically Traffic Analysis Hub. And that allows me to, there's a huge source of data going in there that will tell me about context in which the supply chain lies. And so kind of using technology in that way, not only to understand existing supply chains, but to think about forthcoming supply chains, I think is a really exciting development, and one of the ways in which I think the sector can engage technology to really much better understand more deeply the context of supply chains that they have no chance of visiting.
Excellent. And Nigel?
I agree. I think the digital aspect embraces both what Shaun and Elaine have said. I think the other area which is going to cause everybody to think about digital and data is going to be the fire safety legislation with the golden thread, and actually being able to establish the provenance of what is in the building. That I think that because it will have an impact upon mainstream construction developers to look at the solutions and make sure that when they come to deal the asset, they can demonstrate that it's been built in the way that it was signed off with the right kind of parts to avoid another tragedy, is going to probably get a wider area of the industry thinking about things than perhaps is happening at the moment, where it's very much infrastructure driven.
No, absolutely. So I'm going to prepare you for your last question, where we'll need quite quick answers. And I think this sort of builds on a discussion that's been raised earlier around cost versus value, but actually has just been extended in a way that's talking about willingness to pay. Now, at the moment, supply chains essentially have three flows: material, information, and cash. And quite often, I think cash and cost are the thing we focus most on. But there's a new fourth flow, which is that of carbon. And actually, maybe Elaine would argue that there's a chain around the sort of responsibility angle too. I'm not sure how you would measure that, but that's perhaps something we need to think about. So moving forward, we perhaps have to think about the willingness to pay for all of these requirements. So we could do things in a different way that made us more carbon neutral. We could do things in certain ways that made us more responsible. But is the client willing to pay? So I suppose going forward, what would be your sort of one piece of your one thought which is about how we can actually perhaps balance cost and value, but also that ability to think about the willingness to pay for some of these things that are going to drive the future, such as carbon or greater responsibility. Anybody want to go first?
Yeah, I'll kick off if you like. I wouldn't say willingness to pay. We often hear that from down the supply chains, and the client's never willing to pay. Willingness to invest, yes, and willingness to maybe pay for different things in order to deliver an outcome that represents the value that you expect, I think is a very genuine and useful concept to think about. The difficulty, again, with the way that the construction industry is constructed, its main contractors work off such tiny margins, they're not in a position to invest really. So therefore, there is a responsibility back on the client to change the way in which we contract the work in a way that allows the right investments to deliver a longer term return. It shouldn't be about the cost going up. It should be about investing in the right place at the right time.
Excellent. And 30 seconds, Elaine, and then Nigel.
Absolutely, Shaun. Definitely willingness to invest. And from our perspective, we are already grappling with things beyond carbon. So looking at water, looking at social value, looking at human rights.
Excellent. And Nigel?
It's got to be about value. The one thing that I don't think you're ever going to get away from in the industry is that people will undercut and buy work. That it may well be that with all of the metrics around carbon and fire safety that becomes less easy to do, but there's still a big change in behaviour that needs to take place.
Brilliant. So just bringing those, I'm afraid we haven't necessarily been able to answer all questions. There were some lovely comments that said they particularly liked the way in which Shaun pulled out that by recruiting good skills and highly qualified people in T5, it led to success, and they were interested in where supply chain exemplars currently sit. From my experience, they tend to sit within fast-moving consumer goods or consumer packaged goods because they're industries that are dealing with really, really high volume. And that's where you'll see best practice in terms of out and outright pure play supply chain management from my own experiences. And that's where we try to take good practice and compare it to the construction industry. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Nigel, Shaun and Elaine for what I hope you believe has been a really constructive conversation. We may have been on the edge of a very long cusp, but let's hope that we collectively together and through initiatives such as the Transform Construction Network Plus, but also the Transforming Construction Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund can begin to bring about that change. And I would encourage all of you, if you haven't already done so, to visit the Transform Construction Network Plus website, where you'll be able to download a range of different digests that cover topics such as changing business models. We've got to get to the bottom of that very, very small margin if we are going to be able to make those investments, and different business models are perhaps the key to that. Platform thinking is another way in which we can deliver value at lowest potential cost. And obviously the digest from today, which links to sculpting productivity. Thank you very, very much for attending. My thanks to you all.